Hello and welcome to today's webinar. We'll just wait for a few more people to arrive. Whilst people are arriving, just a quick reminder that this webinar is the last in a series of 3 looking at the high streets and communities, and this one aims to define the concept of the new civic high street as we emerge from the current crisis. So welcome, we've got numbers trickling in at the moment. We've had a great response to our High Streets webinars this autumn. I just wanted to point you all in the direction of the Power to Change website, where we'll be hosting blogs to summarise these events and recordings of the webinars, just in case you missed any of our earlier sessions. Just a couple of points as well, so please do use the chat box to add to the conversation today, and we'll also be live posting on Twitter from our account @PeoplesBiz using the hashtag #SaveTheHighStreets. If you've got any questions for our panellists today, please do put them in the Q&A box for our chair to ask the panel at the end of the session. This session will be recorded. The webinar itself is an hour long and will also be followed by a workshop which runs 2 till 3 p.m. You should have been emailed the link to this already, but we will be posting the link in the chat box towards the end of the session so it doesn't get lost in any of the chat. So now I'll pass you over to our chair for this event, Vidya Lakeson, CEO of Power to Change.
Thanks very much, Tash. Welcome everybody, good afternoon. Thank you for joining this third in our series of webinars on high streets and communities. So over the last 3 weeks, we've talked about community improvement districts at webinar 1, and I'm sure many of you who are listening in were also at that. Is the community improvement district a new way in which communities can be part of the decision-making and the governance of high streets? Last week, we looked at ownership on the high street, and we had a really interesting conversation about how property owners of different kinds, local authorities, as well as private owners, could do more to engage and work with communities. And we're having some really interesting conversations as a result of that around the concept of a social value lease or a community lease. Could private developers, private landowners offer a different kind of lease for community businesses and other kinds of organisations, recognising the huge social value that they can contribute to place? And today we're on to, as Tash has already said, the Civic High Street. And before I move into setting that up and introducing the speakers, I just want to say a really big thank you to the whole Power to Change team and to Ben Stevenson, who's worked with us on this series of webinars. We've had great response. It's been really fantastic to engage with all of you, but all the hard work has been there, so a really big thank you. So as I think it's really clear to all of us, we are in the middle of a really big transformation around high streets and town centres, and many of you will have seen the stats coming out this weekend around shop closures, more than we've seen in previous years. We're right in the middle of the storm. And for the last couple of years, we've heard people talking, including stuff that we've put out at Power to Change, about the need for a shift from thinking about the high street as a commercial space to thinking about it as more of a civic space, a mixed use space, bringing in housing, workspace, public services, alongside the more traditional retail and leisure and hospitality, and also civic and community activity. And in many ways, it's a shift back in time to an era where the town centre had the Guildhall next to the town hall, next to the church. So this isn't entirely new, but it's new sort of in the last sort of 50 years or so, where the town centre has been much more commercial in its orientation. And I think the 2 really important questions that we want to ask today are, what does it really mean to have a civic high street? We're using this sort of conception, but what does that really mean? And our speakers are going to give us their thoughts on what that really means to them. And then I think critically, the most important question is, how do we get from here to there? What are the changes that need to happen? Who are the actors that need to kind of do different things to get us from where we are now, sort of in the middle of the storm, in a period of decline that's been accelerated by COVID, to something new? What will get us there? So we've got 4 fantastic speakers to kick us off. First, we're going to hear from Polly Swan. So Polly's been one of the authors of a report that we published a couple of weeks ago, looking at the contribution of community business and community ownership to the high street and town centres. Polly's based at the LSE, as well as doing various other things. She's going to take us through some of the headline findings from that research. We're then going to hear from Bill Grimsey, former retailer, now a serial producer of some of the best reports on the future of the high street, including most recently a report that really advocated very strongly for greater localism, greater community involvement, and a different way of thinking about how we go forward with the future of the high street. So we're going to hear from Bill. Then we're going to hear from Professor Cathy Parker, who is the director of the Institute of Place Management. And I've been trying to meet Cathy for ages, and so it's great to finally be sitting sort of face to face with Cathy. And Cathy's also the research lead at the High Streets Task Force, so a huge wealth of knowledge that Cathy has about all of these issues. And then finally, we're going to hear from Danny Kruger, the MP for Devizes. I mean, a long-term champion of community-led action, and most recently has published Levelling Up Our Communities, which calls for a much greater role for communities in huge areas of our public life, but including our economic life. So Danny's going to give his perspectives. So without further ado, we're going to turn to Polly. Thanks, Polly.
Lovely, thanks, Vidya. If I could have the first slide, that'd be really helpful. So yes, as Vidya was saying, my colleague Professor Neil and I were asked by Power to Change in April to undertake a piece of research that was looking at the contribution that community businesses can make to the renewal of the high street and how this might happen. As I'm sure you're all aware, Power to Change has been building quite a good body of evidence about the importance of community businesses as part of successful high streets, suggesting that community businesses remain around longer than other forms of private business and help to build community wealth. So really the aim of our research was to provide some interesting examples of what can be achieved by community businesses on the high street, what's working, who's involved, and what models could be tried out and replicated in other areas, really with the hope being that local authorities can be encouraged to think of community businesses as an important part of their high street. If I could have the next slide, please. So we chose 6 community businesses as sort of best practice case studies. We've got the old library in Bodmin. That's sort of, as you can see, an historic high street building that's being used as a cultural facility. There's Made in Ashford in Kent, and that's an independent shop that lets local creative businesses sell on the high street whilst also providing community-based craft activities. On the next slide, we've got Radcliffe Market Hall in Bury. So that's a rejuvenated market hall. It's got a traditional market alongside an evening sort of dine-in street food and community venue. And then the Ultimate Picture Palace in Oxford, and members of the local community there are trying to bring an independent cinema back into community ownership. And then on the next slide, we've got Hebden Bridge Town Centre. This is the town hall there, but it's a thriving town centre that's got a number of community businesses on it, and they're supported by the local authority through a community anchor policy. And then the 6th one is, that's all right, it's the Mid-Steeple Quarter in Dumfries. And that's really an example of a whole high street regeneration approach. It's a community-led initiative, and they're trying to redevelop a group of underused buildings into a live-work quarter. So as you know, community businesses typically deliver what a place needs. They're run by local people who understand their communities, and they offer distinctive services that are tailored to local requirements. But I think what our 6 case studies show is that community businesses can and do offer important wider impacts on the high street. So they serve as destination places that both draw a broader mix of people onto the high street and help ensure that high streets have a sort of a mix of uses and activities. For example, going back to Radcliffe Market Hall, they've consciously redesigned the hall to provide a relaxed sort of family focused environment. So people come and use it during the day and into the evening. And the community businesses we spoke to were also conscious that they are the stewards of important high street assets, and they're willing to use them in different ways and at times of difficulty. And I think we've all seen this during obviously the COVID pandemic and the lockdown, but certainly Hebden Bridge, it's helped build the resilience of the town. It was an important hub for the town's recovery from 3 major sort of flooding events quite recently. We also saw examples of the community businesses building links with other local businesses on their high streets and playing a role in building the vision and reputation for their high street. The Mid-Steeple Quarter has a very clear vision for Dumfries Town Centre, built on local views that they've gathered over a number of years. They want it to be a place where more people can live and work and socialise on the high street. I mean, one of our concerns was that the community businesses might be competing in some unfair way with other local businesses, given that they can often access grants and have subsidised leases and assets. But again, they were very conscious of this and they tried hard to avoid sort of direct competition. And instead we found that they often ended up adding additional services and complementing the high street. I mean, I think undoubtedly the driving force for the community businesses is their local community. But again, local authorities have realised that it is in their best interest to support community businesses. And they've done this through asset transfers, they've done subsidised leases and licenses, and also use the community businesses to deliver important local services. And again, Made in Ashford, it started as a pop-up shop, but it's evolved to have a longer tenancy period and is now being helped by Ashford Council to move into larger premises with some supportive funding. And similarly, Bodmin Community Interest Company, they secured a 10-year lease, but again, it's on a scaling rent, yes. So I think there is a clear need for local authorities to fund and support their local community businesses, especially around the level of funding and low-cost finance to support community asset transfers. And I think that needs to include the planning permission process, business development, and ongoing sustainability of the asset. And again, for the Mid-Steeple Quarter, the initial investment that Dumfries and Galloway Council were able to provide enabled them to sort of get the project going, develop it to such a level that they could then approach other strategic bodies and get more funding. And again, some of those other community businesses, they've also looked at community share issues, crowdfunding to generate income and community buy-in. So if we could have the last slide, please. So really, how can local authorities support their community businesses? Well, local authorities, they are a central player in town centre regeneration. I think post-COVID, they're going to be hopefully ideally placed to capitalise on the government initiatives and to kickstart regeneration. And they can have an important enabling role. So they can provide that initial pump priming investment, provide grants and bridging loans that can overcome early financing problems for community businesses. They can help ensure that high street buildings can be accessed, whether that's through the asset transfer process or perhaps supporting the meanwhile use of buildings and management leases. They can better connect up businesses with vacant properties and provide leases that are either secured or on a scaling, that scale up gradually. And then lastly, I think local authorities can place community businesses at the heart of their regeneration strategies by having a designated policy for community businesses perhaps, and ensuring that community businesses are represented on their bids and their local enterprise partnership boards. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Polly, for that quick overview. There's a lot more in the report, and I encourage all of you to take a look. So I think the role of community and community business is one element of the Civic High Street, something that we have had to change, have pushed quite hard over the last couple of years. So want to hear from you, Bill, as to, you know, what are your thoughts about what the Civic High Street needs to look like and how do we get there?
Well, thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. In 2013, we published a review that said you can't rely on retailing anymore for your health of your high streets and town centres, and it needs to be turned into a community hub based on health, education, entertainment, leisure, experiences, and then you'll get some shops as well. And that argument hasn't changed through our 2018 review and our latest review, which was Build Back Better, which was highlighting the change that happened because of COVID. Now, when our Prime Minister emerged from his situation with COVID-19, he signalled a change in priorities, quoting the Roman statesman Cicero, saying the health of the nation should be the supreme law. And if you look at what is happening today, you've got this conflict between the health of the nation and the economic health of the nation, and the balance is not being hit. And where will that come from? It has to come from the local authorities and the local communities. And our latest review concluded that we need to move to a localism a policy, which is quite interesting right now, because we've got this clash between central government and local governments in how to handle the current challenges. But if we don't allow our local authorities to have the opportunity to put plans together and to engage with all of the community, all the stakeholders, and to have this massive shift away from central government to local communities, we will not make this transition. And so we're advocating localism on steroids. And in order to do that, you need leadership. and the leadership at local authority level needs to be upgraded, frankly. And in the latest review, Neil Schneider, who was the ex-chief executive of Stockton-on-Tees, which did the changes that we've been talking about, he quite clearly says that this leadership will not come from the current cohort, if you like, of leadership out there, and we need to upweight and encourage more people to go into it. And then finally, we have to concentrate on the shift from car culture to the culture of the 21st century, which is technology. So we're going to have to plan around our communities not having cars in towns, and moving this whole agenda away from shops and cars to communities and local economies thriving on the back of those community activities. And if you think about what COVID did to everybody, where we woke up and smelt the fresh air, we realized that we need to go back to local produce and stop shifting stuff all around the world. We need to concentrate on local economies and encourage entrepreneurs in local environments. And we need to concentrate on our heritage and experiences. So these places are great places to visit, with lots of green parks, pocket parks, as well as pedestrianisation and mobility centres where we will not see cars in towns in 15 years' time in any case. So we've got to start managing that, and that requires a leadership change, and we've been calling for it for some time, and hopefully local government will start to upweight its leadership qualities and make this all happen. Okay.
Great, Bill. Thank you very much. There's lots to come back on and questions, but I want to get to all the speakers before we start unpicking some of this. Cathy, over to you.
Thank you very much, Vidya. Well, the new Civic High Street to me means some long overdue changes to our neighbourhood, town and city centres, and thank goodness. I've been researching town centre change at Manchester Met for 23 years, and much of what I touch on in 5 minutes has been a reoccurring theme really since the 1990s, when we realised that local people, local businesses and even local government to some extent had lost control of the economic, social, political and cultural heart of communities. In some respects, as Vidya said earlier, the new Civic High Street looks like that old Civic High Street where the marketplace, town hall and the other important institutions show both the centrality of local decision making and representation, commerce, culture, heritage, as well as the interrelationship between those. So the old Civic High Street to me looks like the Greek agora, an epicentre of local life. The post-war High Street, on the other hand, became an epicentre for business life, well, actually big business life, to be more precise. Now, business is important, but multiple retailers, large property interests, pension funds, even turned our multifunctional, multifaceted high streets in a landscape into a blandscape, as Bill says very articulately. So I think the new Civic High Street should be thought about in two ways. First of all, what it looks like and what it offers. Let's make sure the new Civic High Street takes the best from the old. We need a mix of businesses, but we want businesses that are really invested, embedded in the place, like the ones Polly talked about, but we want commercial businesses too to provide employment and training opportunities to local people, to be well networked with other local businesses and supply chains, the local governance mechanisms, and most importantly, the community in all its wonderful diversity, because this is their customers, so that they can provide them. They need to be able to talk to them so that they can provide them what they want. We need a mix of community services, as Bill said, health, education, leisure. We need green space, blue space, repurposed brown space. It's all important. Spaces and squares that are not defined by consumption, that allow people to move freely, exercise, skateboard, walk the dog without spending any money. The new Civic High Street should be navigable on foot, bike, wheelchair to everyone. And to do this, as Bill said as well, in many places, we'll have to stop preferencing car owners. So that's quite a bit about what the new Civic High Street will look like in terms of what it offers. I think we also need to consider how the new Civic High Street is produced. We're all in agreement what we want them to look like, but how do we make sure we get them? At the IPM, we study the processes of how places are made, maintained, marketed, and managed. This means understanding the relationships between all the players, especially in terms of resources and power. So in a study funded by the Economic, Social and Research Council in 2014, we identified 4 strategies or approaches to town centre renewal. And we think acting on these are important if we want new civic high streets. First, we have to restructure governance mechanism. Localism on steroids, as Bill said. The new civic high street also needs natural partnership working and collaboration across local government, community and business. It's not just about the top-down devolution, we also need to get that partnership working too. Restructuring should also focus on the restructuring and ownership across the high street. The second area to consider is repositioning. Data and evidence are important to decision making. Whilst restructuring can get the right interests around the table, you've got to have good data and evidence to just stop, the people that shout the loudest being listened to. The new civic high street needs to adapt and serve the needs of its communities now and in the future. So sharing data and intelligence is important to the new civic high street. And the third is rebranding, but not in a corporate way. The new civic high street can result from a process through which people uncover and share what they value about a place, what makes it unique. We've termed this placefulness, and it helps engender place attachment or civic pride. And finally, the new civic high street will result from some considerable reinventing. This can mean physical regeneration and change, but actually places can also be reinvented through action and activation. Pop-up shops, markets, murals, flash mobs, all actions that can change the nature of a place in weeks, days, or even seconds. And it's the activation of places that I think that really makes them what they are. People make places, and it will be people that make the new civic high street. Place leaders from the community, from business, from local government, from politics, from everywhere, working together with a passion and a compelling vision. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cathy. That was very comprehensive, and yeah, I mean, there's a lot of consensus in what you're both saying. I think I'd like to come back to why more of this isn't happening, or maybe more is and we're just not as aware. But first, over to you, Danny.
Thanks, Vidya. So inspiring, everything I've just heard. I very much agree with it. Obviously, particularly as a Tory, I adore this emphasis on the old and the fact that we've found in our history and in the traditional model something that's appropriate to the 21st century. And I really recognise that. I recognise that particularly in Wiltshire, where I'm an MP. It devises this wonderful, sleepy little gem of a town from that, hit its peak in the mid-19th century, and yet is having a renaissance right now. It was beginning before COVID, but actually, COVID, for all its horrors, has accelerated a very positive change in devices. And now that, obviously hope that we don't go back into lockdown, but as lockdown's lifted, the place is thriving, and it's thriving on the new model that we're talking about today, which is a mix of all sorts of interesting independent retail, quite a lot of pop-up, spontaneous activity, a lot of civil society activity as well as commercial, and a strong sense of place, and all energized by online. So shops selling online, and I was walking around on Friday, a very, very positive spirit there. So good things are happening. I mean, there's also this huge move accelerated by the pandemic of the move from the cities to the towns and to the countryside, and technology is making places viable once again that were economic hubs for their regions 100 years ago and have declined, now becoming viable again. And this is all very good. I'll just quickly mention that cars have been mentioned. I mean, I just very much echo the aspiration to achieve a revolution in public transport, really important rural transport. Our villages urgently need a far better public transport system, but cars remain and will for a while the lifeblood of these towns, market towns. And there have been some unfortunate attempts to design cars out of some market towns, which I think are misguided. So if you're looking at the old ways, we can't keep the carts out of the marketplaces just yet. We need to let people come in from the hinterland to make them thrive. But I do think there are amazing opportunities driven by technology for far better rural transport. So quickly, just to run through a couple of suggestions, and they echo much of what we've heard already. But the report I did around levelling up communities focused on place, people, and power. So the place agenda, I mean, echo what's been said. We need to design in gathering places into our public space, into our streets and our towns. Very much support the whole asset transfer agenda. I'd like to see a resurgence of the library. And there are lots of interesting ways, community-led ways of doing that. Far more meanwhile uses, maker spaces, pop-up, all of this exciting new model. I'd like to see churches strip out their Victorian pews and become once again civic spaces available for social activity and frankly commercial activity, co-working spaces, that sort of thing. So they're not just used one day a week. And I think they can serve their mission that way too, personally. Hubs, public service hubs, the Conservative Manifesto includes a commitment to family hubs across the country where public services and civil society can co-locate to support families and do preventative work. Around people, I mean, part of this hub agenda, thinking about hubs, I think we need more focus on a brokerage service for volunteers and for civil society. So maybe we have, an amazing upsurge of voluntary spirit and community spirit through the pandemic, but there's still lots of civic functions, trustees, school governors, magistrates, special constables, as well as just work in the community itself. There's a mismatch of supply and demand. We're not getting the volunteers into the roles. And I think we could be quite deliberate around creating hubs and spaces in which that can happen. It can't all be done online. And then finally, around power, and Vidya touched on it. I mean, I'm very interested to hear what you've been discussing in this series already. I mean, we've got to do more than create opportunities for belonging. We need to create opportunities for agency. People need to have actual, the ability to influence their place. And one suggestion I ripped off from, I think the Centre for London, was the idea of pop-up parishes, or more prosaically, community improvement districts, which would be time limited, rather than going through the whole Localism Act process of creating a new parish, having a short period, a time limited period in which a place can have a lot more flexibility and freedom to innovate and for residents to direct the decisions that are made locally, including around planning and public service design and delivery. And I would end with just to echo a point that Bill made. We have an intense series of divisions in our country, social, economic, cultural. They will be reconciled in places. They'll be reconciled by creating opportunities for people to work together. And I think particularly this current tension between health and the economy will only be reconciled if we can achieve effective place policy at place level. And so I do echo the point made about increasing devolution and empowering civic leaders locally to drive the pandemic response.
Great, thank you very much, Danny. Opportunities for agency, I really like that. That's so much part of what community businesses really do locally. And just to pick up your point about churches, if you haven't been there, St Mary's in Paddington, in the less affluent part of Paddington, is an incredible sort of ancient church that is also a community hub, and the two work hand in glove. It still works as a church, but it massively serves its local community. So I commend it to all of you. Amount of consensus, and I always get worried in discussions where we all agree with each other that the people who we should be talking to just aren't in the room. So my first question to you, and then I will take some of the questions from the Q&A, but my first question is really, what's the biggest thing getting in the way? So it feels like there is a lot of consensus, not just amongst us on this webinar, but there's a lot of consensus about the direction of travel. And I know, Cathy, you've some of the research that IPM has done has showed that a lot of town centres are no longer retail dominated, that mixed use is actually more common than we maybe understand it to be. But you all in various ways talked about the restructuring of governance, the restructuring of ownership, so changes in how we do things. So I'd be really interested in your thoughts on what the biggest kind of block is on really fundamental change at this point. Bill, do you want to kick off?
So did you say that posed to me? Sorry.
Yes.
Yeah. Look, I would like to kick off with that. There's a lot going on up and down the country that is not publicised, and in our 2018 review, we highlighted places like Stockton and a whole load of others, and we've just done so again in the Build Back Better review. But what we need is a shift from shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism. And if we could make that shift, we will see a change take place. So we can no longer accept absent landlords in a town, some investment manager who's got a portfolio of 100 properties, and the 4 at the bottom of his list are shut, but his bottom right hand number still gives the return that his bosses want, so he doesn't care about those 4 properties. And to bring that alive, that happened with the BHS closure. And so for 4 or 5 years these places were left completely closed inside towns, and the local authorities were doing nothing about it. And I feel strongly about that too. Their CP powers should be simpler and easier if that's the route they have to take. But we have to encourage a stakeholder capitalism whereby everybody's engaged in the success of the project, and you haven't got this siloistic approach to returns that are just satisfying shareholders. And I think that I'm a capitalist believer, but I am not a shareholder capitalist believer anymore. And I do believe in stakeholder capitalism. I do believe we need to make that shift. And the way to start it is with the property and the ownership of these high streets. Identify who these people are. And if they're in the Cayman Islands and don't care, well, guess what? Get out of town. We don't want you anymore. Let's find a way of community taking on these assets and bringing them alive, because the only way the UK is going to recover from this current economic challenge is through the local economy successes, not national. It's got to be about generating local economies that really work through whatever it might be, enterprise, productivity, and communities getting their teeth into it. And that needs local leadership. And I feel passionately about that particular approach, and I look for leaders to be aggressive about it and to weed out this cancer in our town centres, which is investment people who don't care.
Passion came through loud and clear, Bill. Thank you. I mean, I think one of the things that I've always felt is really powerful about community business on town centres is that alignment between the long-term interest of the people who run that business in the place that they're based, that sense that the community are there for the long term, and therefore as the holders and owners of property and those who run businesses in the town centre, they don't have interest in not thinking about the long-term future of that place. There's complete alignment there, and I think that's been one of the strengths. Cathy, what are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't disagree with anything Bill said there. I suppose I'm interested in the mechanics of things. I mean, why don't things change as quickly as we want them to? And I think one of the problems we've got is a sort of the culture of how decisions get made in town centres, and that needs to change. There's lots of examples now where you can do things differently, that you can trust the community, you can work in partnership with your local businesses. That's got to be the norm. The norm shouldn't be, getting some consultants in every 5 years to do a master plan, or, a retail capacity study, and then £50,000 of the master plan that sits on the shelf for another 5 years till the next lot come in. So, right, that to me, that's the one thing that we could change quite quickly, to just say the way that we make decisions about our town centres and high streets has to be collaborative. We have to have a compelling vision in place. We can't work to the funding, we can't, this is something for Danny here, if something comes up going, oh, you can bid for 25 million, everyone's going to rush away and do that, takes their eye off the sort of the ball of sort of getting a long-term plan in place and the right partnerships in place to really curate and manage that place. Then that's the key thing to be working on, and then fund that. When you've got that in a place, you're going to back a winner. You're not going to, when everyone's sort of jumping through hoops in funding applications, that is not a way to get good sort of visions and good governance in place. So I think that's one thing we could do in the next sort of 12 months, really. It would make a massive difference.
Hear.
Great. Thank you. Danny, there were no questions and now there's about 100 questions. So I'm going to start integrating the questions from the Q&A into the questions I'm asking you. So interested, Danny, in what you think are the main sort of blocks are, but there's also there's a few questions here about how much appetite you think. So there was a lot of emphasis in what you all said about local leadership. Question to you, Danny, about how much you think there is political will to devolve power to local councils. I mean, we're kind of right in the eye of a storm of tension between local and national right now. So what's your thoughts about that?
Well, quickly, three things then. First, I mean, I share Bill's distress at absentee landlords. I think I'd add to that absentee public service leadership that isn't properly accountable locally. But in both, we have systems. You know, the value of absentee landlords is they bring in capital. You know, might be from the Cayman Islands. We can't cut off our towns from the capital markets. We just need to make the capital markets work for our towns. And I agree with your point about ownership. But we can't create sort of autarky in our towns. They simply don't have the asset base. So we do need to bring in money from the outside. So it's a question of how to reconcile that with proper local ownership and responsibility. And I'd apply the same for the public sector. You know, how do we achieve proper local accountability and have high quality and equality itself and standards, and ultimately the ability for people to step in where leadership locally fails the public. So these are not straightforward, but all my prejudices are with you, Bill, on that. Secondly, the point about consultants, and I mean, I think we should have a rule that I'm very familiar with it from when I was working in White City in West London, a place that, you know, not only have vast amounts of money spent on the place by the public sector without any local people being able to influence it, but periodically, almost monthly, a batch of consultants would arrive from outside the area to sort of poke around and write a report for somebody to determine how services or investment should be made there. Places should not be exploited. Their data, their insights they belong to the people who live there, and I think we should be paying local people for that sort of intelligence, not external consultants. And I think for commissioning, we need a model of collaborative commissioning in which everyone brings their sort of assets to the table rather than having this very transactional and competitive model of inviting people to sort of fight like rats in a sack for a limited pot of money. So with you on the question of political will, I mean, you know, this government is really committed to devolution. It wants to put more power into places. It recognises that, you know, the Brexit referendum wasn't just about taking back control from Brussels. It was a rejection of London as well. And we're not going to level up the country just by from the centre deciding which places get which investments. It's got to be driven from places. But exactly how that's to be done, given, I mean, the politics of this, you know, there's a devolution white paper due. There's going to be a lot of anxiety among local government leaders about how that's to be done. Obviously, we've got our troubles with a certain mayor this week, but other mayors have been tremendously cooperative, and so there's no inherent dispute between central and local. It's about getting a system right that can work. But yes, I mean, there is definitely political will for this. My dream is that the government and my party generally just goes beyond just to sort of, you know, let's move power down from one shelf to another, from London to cities. We need to, or even to towns. We need a more bottom-up, sort of organic model of community power, where probably a lot messier, but where different organisations, parishes, community groups of residents can exercise agency, as I said earlier, and have genuine responsibility for their places, rather than just, you know, shifting power from Whitehall to City Hall.
Great, thank you. Polly, coming to you, interested in your thoughts and whether you saw anything in the case studies that you looked at of much more collaborative working. So picking up on Cathy's point, so were there sort of shining examples of good practice in some of the case studies that you looked at? And picking up one of the questions from Graham from the Q&A, so he asks, so what proportion of community businesses can slot into the high street? So Graham was very involved in the creation of Made in Ashford when he was the councillor in Ashford. So I think it's a question of how much of this do you think could happen more widely? What kind of scale do you think this sort of community ownership could take?
Gosh, that's quite a big question. Thank you. Well, yeah, well, actually, Made in Ashford, I think that is quite a good example of that collaboration. As I say, it sort of started as a pop-up. So there was a derelict or an underused shopping centre in Ashford, and they wanted to encourage some businesses to through the pop-up scheme. But one of these happened to be this little community creative business, which they've really sort of nurtured through and let it grow, gradually build up its capacity with support, and now move on to the next phase. I mean, it has had quite a lot of council phase, so I think the support. So I think the next challenge will be for that community business to become more financially independent with support from the council, but move in and perhaps sort of access funding from other sources. And I think, and we did take the mid-steeple quarter approach because it is a whole regeneration approach from Scotland. So it's got a slightly different sort of angle there, and Scotland is sort of doing their own really interesting work as well. But again, that's a collaboration. It is very much community-led, but they've involved strategic bodies, local businesses, and also sort of private enterprises as well, and tried to bring them all together to sort of shape the vision for the high street. They've got this asset transfer in process at the moment, but I think they recognise if they're going to regenerate this quite large block on the high street, they're going to have to bring landlords in with them on that, and perhaps encourage landlords to take on some of the improvements themselves and build it all together. So it has got to be very much a vision for the whole town. It can't just be the community business on their own. There needs to be the council, other strategic bodies, private sort of businesses involved as well. As for how much community business ownership you can have on the high street, I don't know, Vidya, you might have a bit more sort of knowledge on that. I think it does depend how much capacity is in the community, how much the local authority wants to sort of support that as well, and also obviously independent businesses as well. So I think it does need to be very much a sort of a collaborative approach, really. Yes, I wouldn't like to say how much sort of community businesses could be a percentage on the high street, but I think there's definitely a role for them, you know, as part of the wider mix on the high street, and they can build in that resilience as well. I think, you know, they get that community sort of buy-in, and they let the community have a role in regenerating the high street and what they want their area to be.
Great, thanks, Polly. Yes, it was a slightly unfair question. I'm not actually sure what the right answer would be, but more than there currently is, I think would be my start on that. There's a couple of questions here around ownership, which is something we've touched on. So I just wanted to build on that a little bit. So Roland asks, a big change post-war has been the consolidation of land ownership. So how can this be broken down again to create a more diverse ecology of ownership? So I'd be interested in your thoughts on that. And then I'm going to read out another question from Angela Vincent, who she describes a scenario, and I think it's really speaking to some of the things that you said, Bill, but so this is a developer scenario rather than an owner sort of scenario. But it says she says we have to legislate for some of this stuff, which I think is referring back to all the things that you've been talking about. I live somewhere where I have 2 estate management charges levied on top of the council tax and 2,000 plus residents paying into one, and no one has a vote on how our money is spent. It's all decided by the developer. How do we do this? We have 2 Costa coffees and no independence allowed because it doesn't work for the developer. So it isn't a question so much as there are these examples of how consolidation of power and ownership are leading to things that people don't want in their local communities. So how do we start to fragment this and break it up and create more plural ownership? Bill, you're nodding, so I'm going to come to you first. I know you feel very strongly about this. So what are the solutions here? I mean, Danny said very, very rightly that we still need capital for our town centres. So how do we start to change ownership patterns without depriving communities and places of vital capital? Because the public sector doesn't have enough capital to do this on its own. We need private capital. You're on mute, Bill.
The important thing is that we got to go back to the starting point. And if we have the local authorities getting visions and plans together that are holistic and not just based on one particular pocket of land, they have to have a holistic picture. They can then start to work for public and private investment. What is clear is that the market doesn't work, does it? Look what we've got. The market forces and developers coming in, finding brownfield sites, wanting to put this up, wanting to put that up, which doesn't fit some holistic plan of going forward, doesn't work. my generation cloned every town in the country. It's failed. So it needs to be guided by a complete picture. So instead of having a developer come along and say, see that pocket of land there, I want to put that in, and the local authority could look at that picture of plan and say, well, actually, we don't want that there. We want a pocket park there, because that church that's on the corner of it is going to be deconsecrated, and it's going to become a fresh food market with finger food on the weekends, and people are going to use that green park, and it's going to have some music. It's going to be fantastic. And that happens in Roeselare in Belgium as a result of the first Grimsey review, and that mayor has made that happen. Now, so it's about the holistic picture, and that's why trying to understand, and you need to keep evolving this, but trying to understand that you won't have cars in town centres by 2050. It's not going to happen. I'll be dead anyway, but it isn't going to happen. So how do you work towards that? You're not even going to be able to buy a new petrol car after 2030. So, you know, what is happening with mobility hubs inside town centres? Who's thinking about this? If you rely on the investors to do it and there's private money to do it, they'll come along and they'll cherry pick, and they'll just look at the bits that work for them. And so you need to have a holistic approach to it. And there are plenty of examples of where this does work. I've mentioned Stockton. I think the Scottish Town Partnership, by the way, and Phil Prentice, what they do up there is absolutely first class. I think the Institute of Place Management that Cathy runs has fantastic ideas about how that might evolve. And it, unfortunately, it gets confused by this throwing out of money, you know, 25 million to go for. And people, I can tell you now, these people that are going for this town's money that they've got to submit in January, coming to people like me saying, can you help us build your plan? I'm like, well, actually, I'm retired. No, I can't. But so they wind up going to these consultants to get this 25 million. But you know, it's going to be a failed policy. It isn't going to work, because what about the towns that haven't got any of that money? What about the towns that have been left out? And how have they been chosen? So there's, you know, it's a very complex thing, and that's why you need to decentralize it, get it down to local people, get it down to local leadership, build brave plans about the local economy that are going to build the enterprise up, and whatever it might be, manufacturing is going to come back to the UK. That is going to happen. We're not going to. My grandchildren are not going to live with fast fashion. I can tell you that now. They're going to wait after COVID, when you've still got the climate change thing. They're going to start to buck against that. And so why don't we make stuff here? And where are the entrepreneurs that are being encouraged to come up with this? That's the positivity. And if you leave it to just the market, it will fail. It just won't happen. So you've got to try and help lead it.
Okay, great. Cathy, I'm going to come to you, but I just want to add in a couple of questions, just not to make this even more difficult, but there's a lot. I mean, what Bill's sort of pointing to and what we've come up with or talked about already is the importance of local leadership. There's a couple of questions which are really sort of saying, so what do you do in the absence of great local leadership? So, you know, if public sector leadership is, this is Tom's question, if public sector leadership is weak, how can the private sector or communities affect devolution? Also, Tom saying not all areas have strong and effective leadership along the lines of Bernstein, Salisbury, or even Burnham. You've done a lot of work with IPM, through IPM, with local places, with local leaders. How do we grow the place leaders of the future, not just in local authorities, but across the piece? Like, what is it that needs to happen to change, to improve that?
That's key. I mean, places belong to everyone, really, and anyone can be a place leader, and we see place leaders from across, you know, the public sector, community, businesses, everywhere. Young people, old people. It's people with passion and drive who will be the glue and sort of knit people together and realise, you know, there's a big picture here that we've got to go for. Now, of course, we need our council leaders to have a place leadership mindset too. You know, it's not, they may be sometimes as strong leaders, like in Stockton on Tees, you've got a real, you know, you've got everything in sort of embodied in one person. That's quite rare, really. You sort of need it across quite a few people. You need them to work together. So that collaborative working is really important. We absolutely have to support people with skills and knowledge. So place management and leadership has just been like, oh, it just happens. You know, it's nothing special about it. You have to go and do, you know, be chartered to be a planner, but anyone can go around and position themselves as a work their way up through the ranks of the local authority and end up as a chief executive. I know it's a little bit more harder than that, and I'm sorry to any chief execs on the call, but place leadership is a skill, and place management needs to be invested in. We need the people to coordinate and make this happen. And I'm afraid, you know, a lot of that's been lost, and had some false starts as well. You know, we people race ahead and sort of have you know, we'll do town centre management, and some town centre management was fantastic and some of it wasn't very good. The same way, you know, a lot of bids are fantastic, but then you get some that aren't very good. And it's like, how do we make sure that anyone that's responsible for the sort of curation and development of place, wherever they're coming from, has got the right skill set? So we absolutely have to say they need it. That's the first thing we say. You can't do place management and leadership. You can learn it, you know, through experience and so on, but it's a lot better if you get some help and support. And we have some sort of standards that say perhaps some of these people just haven't got the skills, and if they're not willing to learn them, they're in the wrong job.
Okay, that's go out there. Danny, I'm going to come to, well, actually no, I'm going to go to Polly first. Polly, there's a question here about markets. And I just wondered what your thoughts were from having looked at the market in the report, whose name's escaping me right now.
Radcliffe Market
Hall, exactly. So let me just try and find that question. I've lost it. But anyway, it was a question about the role of markets in town regeneration. I just wondered what your thoughts were, having looked at Radcliffe Market Hall, which is in Bury. What would you draw out from that?
It is, yes. I mean, we didn't look at open air markets, and although people sort of did touch on that, and I think it is an area that often local authorities perhaps are a little wary of taking on. I think they're quite a big aspect of perhaps a town to take on and manage. So I think that's where sort of Radcliffe was quite interesting. The council, they still own it, but it's the Radcliffe Community Benefit Society. They were able to put a bid together and were successful to get the management lease for that. And really over a really quick period of time, sort of 18 months, they were able to get a group of people from the community who wanted to make the market hall work. There was one lady in particular, and sadly she died quite recently, but she had a little cafe in the market, and she really saw the market as being a focal point for Bury. And so working with a couple of other people, they put this bid together. And they, again, I think they were quite enterprising. They saw that it needed to be just more than just a daytime space that people can come and get their vegetables and whatever. It had that potential to create an evening time economy, and that was where they were going to generate their income, by having a space where people could come and eat, socialise, perhaps get a beer that they've sourced from a local brewery. And that's where they get quite a lot of their income, is through their evening sort of dine-in street food. I mean, see, COVID, they were able to remain open and provide that critical service, you know, providing the fresh fruit and vegetables. Again, and it's an outdoor space, so hopefully they've been able to get people in for the dine-in aspect as well. So I think market halls can really work. I think they would like to then perhaps, you know, in the future, take on the ownership or have a more permanent sort of management lease of the market. But it was a really inspiring project, and the council has really seen the potential that it has, and they've built it into the regeneration strategy for Bury, and they're planning the regeneration of the town, you know, with the market very much as a focal point, sort of going forward. So yeah, it was a really, really interesting example.
Great, thank you. Danny, just to add another question into the mix. So we were talking about ownership, breaking up existing ownership structures, creating more plural ownership. So Matthew McKeague is asking, to help tackle the ownership issues in town centres, would the government support a land commission like in Scotland? So I don't know if you have any views on that. I'm not that familiar with the land commission in Scotland, but
well, I mean, I think it was a attempt to try and get what was essentially common land out of private ownership, and to create more local and distributed ownership models for land in Scotland. And you know, I understand the impulse to it. I mean, I just I waver between my communitarian and my capitalist impulses as a conservative, and you know, I'm worried about I fear the tragedy of the commons. You know, when nobody owns, when everybody owns something, nobody owns it, and the public sector has not been traditionally very good at looking after public assets. It's why I'm actually a great believer in communitisation or in transfers to non-profit independent organisations that operate commercially, but they're held in trust for the community. They redistribute their profits back within the local economy or into the institution itself, rather than off to the Cayman Islands. And I think we need to focus on that as rather than this eternal and sterile dispute between public ownership versus private. But there no doubt is, I do think we need to think about land ownership and just we need to think about power, two things that we Tories haven't always been very good at having conversations about. And I think we'll end up with quite a conservative outcome if we did that. So, but the idea is valid, and ultimately we have the great inequalities in our country are around assets, not income. We do need a redistribution of ownership and wealth itself.
Thanks, Danny. I'm very conscious of time, and I do want to finish on time because we've got the workshop coming up. So I'm going to, unfortunately, draw this to a close now. There are more questions in the Q&A than we've even remotely got to. So apologies to those who haven't had their question answered. I think in summing up, I would sort of draw out a question from Toby Lloyd, which we're not going to get to answer, but I think he says the level of consensus is very encouraging, and I would agree. I mean, we've really had a lot of consensus around the issue of ownership, around local leadership, around the need for partnership at local level. It feels like there are solutions there, and I think we've heard examples of where those solutions are being put into practice. Toby then goes on to say, but also raises the question of why this isn't happening if everyone agrees, and that probably reflects who's not in the room to some degree. And he says there must be strong reasons, inertia, vested interests. So what are the levers that could overcome these barriers? I'm not going to give you a chance to answer that, but I think we've talked about some of them: the need to get more plural ownership, the need to develop stronger place leadership, the need to create more effective partnerships between different stakeholders at local level. But it is encouraging, I think, at the end of this that each of you, coming from your own perspectives, has kind of reached similar places in terms of what really matters for the future of the Civic High Street, including which is about more plural ownership, more roles for other stakeholders to be involved, not just business and not just local authorities. So I think there is a roadmap going forward. I think it comes back to, I suppose, to some of what Bill said in one of his answers, which is it's about thinking bigger picture and longer term at the place level about what you're trying to create and how you're going to get to some of those longer term outcomes like car free, etc., in terms of how things go forward. So I will wrap it up for this for now. Thank you, a huge thank you to our speakers who've all made fantastic contributions. Just to say, we are going to write up and distill the best of the 3 webinars that we've done over the course of the last 3 weeks on communities in the high street, and we will be sending that report out to all of you who've taken part, as well as using it to go back to government and make the case for things that could help us move in a more positive direction. So so look out for that in the next few weeks. The link to the workshop is in the chat, so those of you who are able to stay, it will be an opportunity to delve in more deeply to some of the issues that we've alighted on in the webinar, really figure out maybe some of those things that can start to unlock some of the change that we're looking for, building on the great points that our speakers have made. So for those of you who are going on to the workshop, enjoy. For those of us who are leaving at this point, a big thank you to our 4 speakers, and thank you all for listening in. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Bye.